The door was the same. That was the first thing she noticed, stepping down from the hired carriage onto the gravel sweep of Ashvere Hall in the gray October morning of 1821. The door was the same. Oak, iron-banded, set beneath a stone arch that wore its age in green stains, and one long crack running from the lintel to the keystone. She had stood before that door once before, in January of 1818, in the snow, with nothing in her hands but a letter and a certainty that was itself a kind of poverty. She had stood there for 6 minutes. She had counted them by the sound of her own breathing in the cold. And then the steward had opened a small panel above the knocker and told her that Lady Halstow was not at home to persons without prior arrangement, and that no assistance could be extended to persons with no established claim on the family, and that she was to take herself away. She had taken herself away. Now she stood on that same gravel in a green wool traveling dress that had been made for her 3 months prior by a dressmaker in Manchester, a dress that fitted properly at the shoulders, that did not pinch at the wrists, that was not borrowed or retrimmed, or 2 seasons past its time. The housekeeper, a woman of 60 with gray hair drawn back beneath a cap, stood 2 steps down from the door with her keys already in her hands, and she said, "Miss Marchmont, the household is ready for your inspection, if you will come in." The household was ready for her inspection. Cecily did not allow herself to stand still for more than 3 seconds. She walked forward. The gravel sounded exactly as it had in the snow, that particular giving crunch of small stones loosened by frost, and then there were the 2 steps, and then there was the threshold, and then she was inside Ashvere Hall for the first time in her life. The entrance hall was larger than she had imagined it from the cold exterior, its stone floors covered in worn Turkey carpet, a staircase rising to the right in 2 broad flights. The plasterwork above her was cracked in one corner and in need of attention. 2 footmen stood at attention near the servants' passage, both young, both uncertain. A fire burned in the grate set into the far wall, throwing warmth that she had not expected, and beside the fireplace, with a small stack of papers under his arm and his hat already in his hand, stood Mr. Edmund Vane. He was taller than she had registered at the auction house in Derby, where she had seen him only at a distance, across the room, and later in the solicitor's chambers where they had conducted the transfer through an intermediary, and she had sat on the far side of a wide table, and he had spoken mostly to her agent, a man named Croft. Here, without the buffer of that formal distance, he occupied the hall with the particular quality of a man who had decided to take up no more space than necessary, and had not entirely succeeded. He was 34, she knew from documents. His hair was dark, worn short, and he had not shaved that morning. He wore a plain dark coat and no jewelry beyond a plain waistcoat watch chain. His face, in the firelight, was composed. It had the quality of composure that comes not from ease, but from long practice. "Miss Marchmont," he said, "the final papers are in order. I will leave them with your housekeeper." "Thank you," she said. "I hope the house has not been an inconvenience." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "It has been a property," he said. "Properties are not inconveniences." He placed the papers on the hall table. He put on his hat. He walked past her out the door, and the gravel crunched under his boots. And then the sound of his horse's departure moved down the drive and faded into the gray morning, and Cecily was alone in the entrance hall of Ashvere Hall, which was now hers, which the law said was hers, which still smelled of another family's candles, and cold, and private grief. She kept her breathing slow. She kept her hands at her sides. She had not come here to feel triumphant. She was not certain what she had come to feel. She was inside the door. She was standing where she had been told she could not stand. That, for the moment, was enough. Her father had been a merchant of Manchester. a man of industry and warmth and no particular genius for preserving what he accumulated. He had built his moderate fortune across 20 years of wool and later cotton, and he had spent it with the generosity of a man who believed the current would always run upward. He had kept a good house. He had employed 12 people. He had sent his daughter to a school in York that taught her French and watercolor and the theory of music and the particular social grammar of a class she did not quite belong to, which was, she understood only in retrospect, the cruelest preparation he could have given her. He died in February of 1817, and the debts came with the spring. Cecily Marchmont had been 21 years old when she sat across from her father's solicitor, Mr. Peel, and listened to the figure. She had sat very still. She had said, "Is there nothing that can be retrieved?" And Mr. Peel had said there was the question of her godfather's obligation, a moral debt of honor that Lord Halstow of Derbyshire had incurred to her father in a matter of business some 15 years prior, a debt that had never been formally discharged. She had said, "I will write to him." Mr. Peel had advised against it. She had written the letter herself, in her father's name, setting down the nature of the debt and the situation it had produced, and asking only for a loan sufficient to resolve the most pressing obligations. The letter was returned unopened. On the outside, in a hand she did not recognize, 4 words. No claim acknowledged here. She had kept the letter. She did not know why, precisely. She had kept it the way a person keeps a stone that struck them in the face. Not from sentiment, but because it had the quality of evidence. It had taken her 8 months to make the journey to Derbyshire, to stand at the door of Ashvere Hall in January of 1818, because she had no carriage and no funds for a post-chaise, and the journey had to be made in stages, by the good offices of acquaintances, who could not quite bring themselves to refuse a young woman traveling alone in the cold. She arrived at the hall on an afternoon when the snow had been falling since morning. She knocked. The panel in the door opened. The steward, a thin man with pale eyes and a red neckerchief, looked down at her. She told him who she was and what she wanted. He said, "Lady Halstow's instructions are that no charity can be extended to persons with no established claim on the family. You are no one, and nothing. You should not have come." The panel closed. She walked 3 miles back toward the village in the snow, before a farm cart picked her up. What came after was not a story she told often, or thought of in terms of narrative progress. It was simply time, and within time, the accumulation of small choices. She found work as a governess to a manufacturing family in Sheffield, a family of no particular refinement, but of great practical warmth, who paid on time and did not require her to pretend she was something she was not. She stayed 3 years. She read everything in the household's modest library. She wrote to Mr. Peel twice a year because he had told her there was the possibility, uncertain, of an investment her father had made in a cotton spinning concern in Manchester, a concern that had been troubled when he died, but which was, at last report, showing signs of recovery. The letter arrived in the autumn of 1820. The investment had paid out. It was not a fortune. It would not have seemed like much to anyone who had grown up expecting comfort. It was, however, precisely sufficient to buy Ashvere Hall at auction after 3 years of foreclosure proceedings had quietly stripped the Halstow estate to its debts and its walls. She had bid through Croft, her agent. She had paid in full. The deed bore her name. She thought sometimes that her father would have laughed. She was not entirely certain he would have approved. The first week inside the hall was a week of rooms. She walked each one in the afternoons, learning the particular sounds a house makes when it has been poorly maintained and half emptied. The creak of floorboards in the long gallery, The rattle of a sash window in the west-facing morning room. The drip somewhere in the kitchen passage that had stained the flagstone's copper. She did not mind any of it. She had a list. The list grew each day. She spoke to the 3 remaining servants. She wrote to a carpenter in Matlock. She wrote to Mr. Peel about the condition of the roof. The drawing room was the room that held her longest. It faced southwest, which meant that in the late afternoon it caught the October sun at a low angle, the light coming in across the old Axminster carpet in long, warm columns. The fireplace was grand and empty. The grate had not been laid since before the auction, and she had not ordered it laid yet. She was not certain she was ready to make the drawing room comfortable. Comfort felt like a claim she had not yet earned the right to make on the room that had, in another family's tenure, been the room where Lady Halstow decided who was worth receiving. She walked its perimeter. She counted the windows. She stood in the bay and looked out across the frost-brown lawn to the yew hedge that divided the formal garden from the kitchen garden beyond. She had stood in that garden in the autumn sun and told Edmund Vane the whole of it. She had not intended to tell him the whole of it. It had come out in the plain way that things come out when you have not been asked the right question in a very long time. On the 3rd day, one of the young footmen came to her in the library and told her, with a voice that had gone very careful, that the east stovepipe had cracked in the night, and there was a smell of smoke in the upper passage. She went with him to look. The passage was cold and dark, and smelled of old plaster and something faintly acrid, she said calmly. That the stovepipe was to be sealed, and the grate not used until a man had looked at the flue, and she watched his face relax from its frightened tension, back into something approaching ordinary attention. His name was William. He was 17. He had been kept on by the auction administrators, and was not certain yet whether keeping on was the same as being wanted. "You will let me know," she said, "if anything else wants looking at. I rely on you and Mrs. Draper to know this house better than I do, for the present." William said, "Yes, Miss Marchmont." She turned from the passage toward the library door and found Mr. Vane standing at the corridor's end, watching. He had come, she learned a moment later, to deliver the final adjusted figures on the drainage easement for the western field, a document that had been omitted from the original transfer through no one's fault and that required her signature. He had not announced himself because the front bell was not yet repaired. He held out the document without speaking. She signed it on the library table. "The East Wing corridor," he said, after she had handed it back, "is not safe to walk unaccompanied after dark. There are several floorboards that need replacing, and one that has given entirely. I have had it flagged in the survey I left with your agent. But it is worth knowing by memory, rather than by document." She looked at him. His face was as composed as it had been in the entrance hall, but she noticed that he had, at some point in the past 30 seconds, moved 2 steps farther into the library. She could see his hands more clearly now. His left hand rested against the spine of a shelf. The gesture had no particular purpose, and did not look like a gesture that knew it had no purpose. "Thank you," she said. "I shall keep to the soundboards." "You are managing the staff well," he said. He did not say it as a compliment. He said it as an observation, the way a man states the weather. "They are managing me," she said. "I am merely trying to be worth managing." He looked at her, then for rather longer than was customary. Then he put the signed document under his arm, and he left. The soundboards held. The East Wing could wait. Lady Dorothea Halstow had not gone far. This was the first intelligence Cecily gathered in her 2nd week. Not from Mrs. Draper directly, but from the boy who brought the milk and who had the particular candor of the very young, and the very unguarded. Lady Halstow, he said, was lodging with her cousin, Mrs. Pelham, whose house sat at the edge of the village 2 miles west of the Hall's Drive. Lady Halstow attended St. Clement's Church on Sundays. Lady Halstow had opinions about the new mistress of Ashvere, he said, and looked immediately as though he wished he had not said it. "I am sure she does," Cecily said. "Thank you for the milk." She encountered those opinions at first through their edges. A coldness from the vicar's wife, who had been warm on first meeting and was cooler at the second. An invitation to a gathering at Mrs. Pelham's, her cousin, which arrived on Tuesday and was, she thought, more interesting for having arrived than troubling for its contents. She accepted it. She went. She wore the green wool dress and her mother's pearl earrings, which were the only jewelry she possessed, and which she wore on occasions she deemed significant, which were the occasions she expected to be difficult. The gathering was in Mrs. Pelham's drawing room, a warm, cluttered space of comfortable chairs and embroidered fire screens and a smell of dried roses. There were 9 women present when Cecily arrived, and Lady Halstow was the 10th. Seated in the chair nearest the fire, in a gown of black silk that had once been expensive and still carried the authority of its origins. She was 61. She had the face of a woman who had been handsome young and had turned the handsome to stone as a deliberate project. Mr. Vane was also present, which Cecily had not expected. He stood near the window, a cup of tea in his hand, speaking in low tones to an older gentleman she did not recognize. He looked across the room when she entered. He did not look away immediately. Lady Halstow spoke within 5 minutes of Cecily's arrival. The conversation had turned, naturally and with the mechanical inevitability of such gatherings, to the subject of Ashvere Hall and its restoration. Mrs. Pelham asked, with the careful warmth of a woman managing a difficult guest, whether Miss Marchmont found the house very much in need of attention. "A great deal," Cecily said, "though I find it a pleasure to give it." Lady Halstow set down her teacup. "I wonder," she said in the measured, carrying voice of a woman who had never needed to raise it, "that you find anything about it a pleasure. Given that you are, as I understand it, no one, and nothing, with money merely recently come to her. It is one thing to buy a house. It is quite another to belong in it." The room went quiet in the particular way of drawing rooms in which something has been said that cannot quite be unsaid. Cecily looked at Lady Halstow for a measured moment. She did not flush. She had flushed once at a door in the snow, with her father's letter in her hand. She did not flush now. "I confess," she said, "that belonging is an aspiration I share with most of the human family. I hope to grow into it." She heard from somewhere near the window the very quiet sound of a cup being set precisely in a saucer. She did not look at Mr. Vane. She stayed for the full hour. If you have ever watched a woman walk back to a carriage after an hour in a room that did not want her and kept herself absolutely upright for the entire distance across the gravel, stay a little longer. What comes next is the part that matters. She found the letter 3 days later. She had not been methodical about the deed box in the library. She had set it aside on her first inspection as containing estate documents of no immediate relevance to the repairs, and it had sat on the corner of the library table covered by a cloth while she attended to more pressing matters. On a Wednesday afternoon, with the carpenter finished in the east wing and the flue pronounced sound and the accounts for the month set in order, she lifted the cloth and opened the box. The estate documents were there. The original Halstow entail, the survey from 1809, a bundle of letters between Lord Halstow and his steward that she leafed through briefly and set aside. And at the very bottom of the box, beneath a leather portfolio of receipts, There was an envelope she recognized before she had fully registered that she recognized it. The handwriting on the outside was her father's. She sat down. She turned the envelope over. It was still sealed. The wax was old and faded, pale brown now where it had once been red. On the front, in different ink, 4 words in a hand that was not her father's. No claim acknowledged here. He had sent a second letter. She sat with it in her hands for some time. Outside, the October garden moved in a slow wind. The fire in the library grate ticked. She thought of the letter she had sent, and which had been returned to her, and she understood now that she and her father had both knocked on the same door and been given the same answer in the same words, and that she had not known it. That she had stood in the snow believing she was making one attempt, where in fact she was making 2. She did not open it, did not. It was her father's letter. It was sealed. She put it in the pocket of her dress. She was sitting in the garden an hour later, at the stone bench near the old walled kitchen garden, when she heard footsteps on the path, and Mr. Vane appeared around the corner of the yew hedge. He stopped when he saw her. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I came to look at the drainage channel behind the kitchen garden. It was flagged in the survey. I did not know you were here." "Sit down, if you like," she said. She had not intended to say it. He sat at the far end of the bench and looked at the kitchen garden wall, which was old brick, warm even in October, with the ghost of an espalier apple trained along its south face. "Why did you want this house?" he said, after a moment. It was not quite a question, not quite a statement. It was the way he spoke. She had begun to understand. In sentences that declined to announce their own intent. She told him. She did not tell it well, perhaps. She had not had occasion to tell it before, and the practice was not there. She told it plainly. The letter her father had sent. The letter she had sent. The steward at the panel in the door. The snow in the farm cart. And the 3 years that followed. She left nothing out. But she did not perform any of it. She told it as a record of events. The way she had learned to tell things in the governess's years, when the only private possession left to her was her own precision. He listened. He did not move while she spoke, and he did not look away. When she stopped, he did not immediately fill the silence. "I should have looked more carefully at the history of the property," he said at last. "It was not your history to know." "No," he said. "It was, all the same." She looked at him. He was looking at the espalier apple, which had not been trained in several years, and grew in loose, unpruned arcs away from the wall. She said, "May I ask why you came to Derbyshire?" He did not answer immediately. She watched his left hand, which rested on his knee, close briefly and then relax. "My wife died in November of 1820, he said. "On the road between Harrogate and York. She was 7 months into her confinement. I had urged the journey. She had wished to travel while she still could. The coach was delayed by a snowstorm, and she was confined in a farmhouse, and she did not live through the night, and the child did not live through the night." He paused. "I found it useful afterward to be in different places than the ones I had known." She did not say she was sorry. He had not told it in a way that invited sympathy. He had told it in the same key she had told her own story, as a record, and she received it as one. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "Yes," Cecily said, though he had not asked. He looked at her then. Something in his face had not changed in expression, precisely, but its character had altered, the way a landscape alters when a cloud passes from in front of the sun. He stood. He said good afternoon. He walked back around the yew hedge, and she heard his footsteps on the path until they faded toward the drainage channel. And then there was only the wind in the walled garden and the sound of a late bee working the last of the autumn mint at the garden's edge. That night, in her room, she took the letter out of her pocket and set it on the dressing table and looked at it for a long time. She did not open it. It was her father's business, not hers. What it said mattered less than the fact of it. The fact of him having tried, the fact of the door having been shut twice, the fact that she was sitting on this side of it now, and the door was hers. The Matlock Assembly Rooms held their autumn subscription ball on the third Friday in October, and Cecily went because she had determined, before she arrived in Derbyshire, that she would not hide inside a house she had fought 3 years to own. She wore a gown of cream silk with a spencer of pale amber, and her mother's pearl earrings, and she arrived precisely when propriety required, rather than fashionably late, because she had learned in the governess's years that fashionable lateness was a luxury of the already noticed. The rooms were warm and full. The orchestra played a country dance she recognized from Sheffield. She found herself accepted into a group near the far wall, respectable women of the neighborhood who had not been in Mrs. Pelham's drawing room, and who were therefore beginning their acquaintance with her without Lady Halstow's introduction. She danced once with a young clergyman who was a little nervous and very earnest. She drank her negus slowly. She thought, achieving exactly the evening she had intended. She saw Mr. Vane across the room after the second set. He was speaking to the vicar, Mr. Ashford, and to a man she did not recognize. He had not looked in her direction. This was not unusual. They had a professional rather than social acquaintance, and she had given him no reason to seek her out in company. What she had not anticipated was Miss Penelope Frayne. Miss Frayne arrived on Lady Halstow's arm at the interval, a young woman of 22 in a pale blue gown with blonde hair dressed elaborately, and a manner of moving through a room that suggested every doorway had been designed to receive her. She was lovely in a manner the room immediately registered. The heads turned. The gentleman near the door made small adjustments in posture. Lady Halstow moved her through the assembly with the deliberateness of a woman placing a piece on a board. The piece was placed near Mr. Vane within 10 minutes. Cecily watched this from across the room without alarm, because she had no claim on Mr. Vane and no expectation of one, and because she was occupied in a conversation about the repair of St. Clement's Tower with the vicar's wife, who had remembered, apparently, that she had been warm on first meeting and had decided to return to warmth. What she did observe, because the room was not large and she was practiced at observation, was Miss Frayne drawing Mr. Vane a step apart from the group, and speaking to him in a private undertone, and watching his face as she spoke. She could not hear the words. Mrs. Hartfield, who had been standing closer, told her afterward, in the carriage home, what Miss Frayne had said. She had said, in her light, carrying voice, that she understood the woman who had purchased Ashvere Hall had been turned away from its very door some years prior, in a state of considerable need. No one, and nothing, Miss Frayne had said, with a sum of money newly come to her. I wonder that such a person would present herself in society as though the money changed the matter. She saw his face go absolutely still. It was the stillness she had come to recognize as his strongest response to anything. His stillness was not emptiness. It was attention compressed to a single point. She did not know what Miss Frayne had said. She knew, from the quality of that stillness, that it had not been pleasant. Miss Frayne returned to Lady Halstow's side. Lady Halstow then turned, with the particular deliberateness of a woman executing a plan, toward the area of the room where Cecily stood. She looked at Cecily. She looked across her, past her, through the space where she stood, to the woman on her other side, to whom she addressed a warm greeting. She did not acknowledge Cecily's presence. She did not look at her directly. She simply omitted her, with the precision of a woman who had been practicing omissions for 50 years and had made them a kind of art. The woman beside Cecily looked uncomfortable. The vicar's wife stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence about the tower's foundation. Cecily stood where she was. She was aware of her own breathing. She regulated it, the way she had regulated it standing at the hall's door in the snow, with counted evenness. A deliberate refusal to let the ribcage show what the ribcage felt. Her mother's pearl earrings were small and cool against her jaw. She fixed her attention on the middle distance, on the arrangement of candles in the far sconce, which were tallow rather than wax, and burned with a slight list to the left. She thought about whether Ashvere's drawing-room candles were wax or tallow, and whether she had told Mrs. Draper to order wax for the winter, and whether the east sash window had been looked at by the carpenter yet. She was at a door again. It was a different door. It was the same door. She was 21 years old in the snow, and she was 23 in the cream silk, and both were true, and she chose, as she had chosen then, to remain standing. And then she heard him. She heard him because the room had become, in the way that rooms sometimes do, briefly quieter at just the wrong moment, the musicians between pieces, and the conversation having arrived at one of those natural pauses that gather and hold for 3 or 4 seconds before breaking. Mr. Vane was crossing the room. He did not cross it quickly. That was what she would remember afterward. Not speed, but intention. The absolute unhurried certainty of direction in a man who moved through a room as though it had offered him passage, and he was accepting the offer quietly. He passed 2 couples and a knot of older gentlemen. He passed Miss Frayne, who watched him with an expression that did not change in time to manage itself. He walked to where Cecily stood, and he stopped, and he turned to face Lady Halstow. The silence gathered again. "She is mistress of Ashvere Hall," he said. "Address her accordingly." Lady Halstow's fan, which had been moving in a slow arc, went still. The room did not erupt. It was not that kind of room, and it was not that kind of moment. What the room did was breathe in, quietly, and then hold that breath. Cecily felt it on her skin, the collective attention of 40 people adjusting to a new arrangement of what was certain. She heard the orchestra, very faintly, behind the closed door at the far end of the rooms. They had moved on to a slower air that she did not recognize, and the sound filtered through as an incongruity, the ordinary world continuing its ordinary business, while the room around her stood suspended between one thing and another. The woman beside her, who had earlier introduced herself as a Mrs. Hartfield of Rowsley, had gone very still. 2 gentlemen near the punch bowl had turned. The young clergyman she had danced with earlier was standing at the edge of the group with his mouth slightly open. Miss Frayne had gone pale beneath her powder. She did not speak, and did not look at Mr. Vane. Mr. Ashford, the vicar, who was standing not 3 feet away, and who had been present at the signing of the deed, said to Lady Halstow, simply, "Ashvere belongs to Miss Marchmont, my lady, as does the matter of who is received in it." Lady Halstow looked from Mr. Ashford to Mr. Vane to Cecily. Her expression did not crumble. It was not built for crumbling. What it did was recalibrate visibly, the way a face recalibrates when it understands that the script it has been running has reached a scene not in its pages. She was not a cruel woman, Cecily thought, watching. She was a woman whose world had always arranged itself correctly around her, who had never been made to stand outside a door in the cold, and who was encountering, for the first time at 61, the possibility that her authority had limits. Lady Halstow said nothing. She turned. She and Miss Frayne moved toward the refreshment table, and the room exhaled, and the orchestra began again. Cecily was looking at Mr. Vane, who was looking at her. "That was perhaps more than was required," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "It was precisely sufficient," he said. She felt something in her chest that was not triumph, and was not relief, exactly. It was something quieter than either of those. It was the particular sensation of weight removed that you had carried so long you had forgotten it was weight. He offered his arm. She took it. They stood together for the remainder of the evening, and the remainder of the evening was, she thought, the most ordinary thing that had happened to her in 3 years. The hired carriage took her back to Ashvere Hall at 11 o'clock, and she went directly to the library, and she lit a candle, and she opened the deed box, and she took out her father's letter. She had thought, on the drive home, that she would read it. Now, holding it, she was not certain she needed to. She knew what he had asked. She knew what had been refused. She knew that the asking and the refusing had been written into the stone of the house itself, into the particular quality of cold at its threshold, into the 4 words in a stranger's handwriting on an envelope sealed so tight it had spent 3 years in a box untouched. She knew all of it. She had lived all of it. She did not need the document. She carried the candle to the fireplace. She held the letter to the flame and watched it catch at the corner, the wax seal brightening briefly orange before the paper took. She set it in the grate and watched it burn. She was still watching the last of it when she heard a knock at the library door, and then the door opened, and Mr. Vane stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. "I thought," he said, "that I might see you home. And then I recalled that you were already home." She almost smiled. "I was?" He looked at the grate. He did not ask what she had burned. He came in, and he stood beside her, and they both watched the last curl of ash settle among the other ash of an evening fire that had been burning since supper. "I was very sorry," he said after a moment, "about Margaret." She looked at him. "I am sorry in the way of a man who has had 2 years to become acquainted with the degree to which the sorrow was his own making," he said. "Not in the way that invites comfort, in the way that is simply a fact one eventually learns to state plainly." "Yes," she said. "I understand the distinction." He looked at her then, and the look was not like the looks he had given her across tables and rooms and that autumn garden. It was the look of a man who had decided something, not in the last 5 minutes, but some time before, and had been waiting to arrive at the correct occasion. She was aware of the warmth of the fire on her left side, and the cold of the room at her back, and the particular quality of the candle light on his face. "I have no title," he said, "and I have no estate. I have a house in Yorkshire I have not been to in 2 years, and a practice that requires more attention than I give it. I am not a recommendation." "You stated the case for the other side very capably this evening," she said. "I stated what was true." "So state what you intend to state now," she said, "and I will tell you whether it is true." His hand found hers. Then, in the space between them, his fingers closing around her gloved ones with a steadiness that was not tentative and was not demanding. It was simply present, the way he was simply present, without performance and without apology. He said her name. Her given name, the first time he had used it, the first syllable of it enough to change the temperature of the room by some unmeasurable degree. "Cecily," he said. She said, "Yes." He did not clarify what the yes was in answer to. He did not need to. She did not need to. She was a woman who had learned, across 3 years of governing and managing and keeping her own accounts, to be precise about what she meant. And the precision was in the yes. And he received it. She was aware of the warmth of his hand through her glove, the slight pressure of his fingers against hers, steady and unhurried. There was nothing in the gesture that performed itself. It was simply a man holding a woman's hand, in a room they were both in. And the simplicity of it was the thing that finally, after everything, made her close her eyes for a moment. The fire settled behind the grate. Outside the tall library windows, the first frost of autumn was laying itself across the lawns of Ashvere Hall, with the quiet industry of a thing that has been waiting for the temperature to turn, and has found it turned at last. The gravel sweep was white at the edges. The stone arch above the door held its crack as it had always held it, untroubled by the cold. In his waistcoat pocket, the cameo of Margaret was at rest. He had carried it for 2 years as a habit and a weight and a form of honesty with himself, and tonight he had not thought of it in the assembly rooms, which he understood, walking home beside Cecily, to be a different kind of honesty, not forgetting but arrival. The house was warm. Both fires were still burning. Mrs. Draper had seen to that, had left the library candles and the drawing-room fire against the late return, had done what housekeepers do when they understand that the late return matters. Cecily looked at the window, at the white lawn, at the stone of the wall that was hers, at the light from inside the house falling out across the frost. She had been turned away from this door in the snow, in January of 1818, with nothing in her hands but a letter, and a certainty that was itself a kind of poverty. She had taken herself away. She had spent 3 years becoming an answer to the question that door had asked her. She had come back. The door was the same. She was not. If this story has sat with you the way it has sat with me, leave a thought below. There are many women who knocked on doors that were not ready to open. This one, at least, opened in the end. The frost on the lawn hardened through the night, and by morning it was solid enough to hold footprints, and the first prints crossed from the front door to the garden gate, going out to look at the kitchen garden wall in the new winter light, and came back. They crossed the threshold and went in. The door swung closed behind them. The house was still.